Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us from all over the world for our event, Medieval Yazd, Modern Climate Lessons. My name is Shiva Tabatabainejad. I'm an alumna of Georgetown School of Foreign Service and Georgetown's Persian Studies program. I will be assisting with the question and answer portion of the event. If at any time you'd like to pose a question, please use the Q&A box so that our moderator and panelists may see it at an opportune time. There will be a designated Q&A portion. Questions, as always, are welcome in both Persian and English and Finglish. I have the pleasure of introducing the founder and director of the Persian Studies program at Georgetown University, Professor Fatima Mustafi.
خانم‌ها آقایان سلام. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our 364 attendees from around the globe. On behalf of the Persian Studies program of Georgetown University, I would like to welcome you to Medieval Yazd, Modern Climate Lessons, our third Jalinous lecture series in the form of a webinar and our first event in the 2021. We really appreciate your presence today and your interest in our cultural events. We will have more events in March for Nowruz traditions, and on April 23rd, the Conference of the Birds. Let me also extend my gratitude to the Jalinous family, without whom these cultural events would not take place. I would like also to give special thanks to Mrs. Mona Khademi and Dr. Abbas Amanat, who helped facilitate the organization of the panelists. I now have the pleasure of introducing our panelists, Dr. Susan Roaf, Mr. Hossein Amanat, and our moderator, Dr. John McNeill. I turn it over to you, Dr. McNeill.
My name is John McNeill. I'm going to serve as the moderator for this event. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be. We have a visual and intellectual feast for you today, a panel with two distinguished presenters. The first speaker will be Dr. Susan Roaf, a professor emerita from Heriot University in Scotland, formerly of Oxford Brookes University. She has taught also in Iraq, Italy, and the USA. She has degrees in architecture and is a practicing architect. And from all I can tell, is one of the true experts on the architecture of Yazd. She will speak first for approximately 20 minutes, and then she will be followed by Hossein Amanat. Hossein Amanat is also a practicing architect, currently based in Vancouver. He's designed several prominent buildings around the world, including the Iranian embassy in Beijing, the Shahyad monument in Tehran, the World Administrative Center of the Baha'i Faith in Haifa, Israel, and a Baha'i temple in Samoa. He too is an expert in the historical, particularly medieval and early modern architecture of Yazd. So with no further ado, I will turn the floor over to Professor Susan Roaf.
Hello, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here to share some of my thoughts about how do we learn from the great architecture of the past. Now, I'm going to talk about place, time, and architecture in relation to the extraordinary city of Yazd. Yazd is called the city of wind catchers, and it's a city that's actually built in the hot, barren deserts of central Iran. It's a fair city and a rare city, and it's actually built from the mud on which it stands. Now, Yazd in the medieval period was a great desert city on the Silk Route that stretched from China in the east to Algeria in the west and via Venice to the markets of Paris, London, and beyond. You can see here that Cairo is marked in that's Saudi Arabia, and Yazd is marked on this map before you. Now, what is the climate of Yazd? It's a hot city, but not a very hot city, being 3,000 feet in elevation. But in summer, a mean maximum temperature might get to 40 degrees centigrade, and in winter, temperatures can fall well below zero. It's a continental climate, therefore it's got a very large diurnal range of 15 to 20 degrees centigrade every day, which means that you've got a huge amount of energy to play with if you're using thermal mass for storage. Now, Yazd has some of the finest architecture in Iran. But more importantly, I think, is Yazd probably has the best passive design of buildings for hot climates in the world. I'd like to see any other city challenge it. And its secrets are profound, the secrets are deep, and the secrets belong to that gentleman who's sitting there having his tea. He is an Ustad of Yazd. He is a master builder. And he is one of a long line who've stretched back through millennia, building such exquisite structures. And I'd like to unpick a little of the story of how they came about. There are two sorts of vernacular buildings. There are slow buildings, and I'm going to talk about those now because the history of the vernacular stretches right back, and we can see here a graph of the Holocene to today, and it's a quasi-log scale, so it slightly accelerates over time. But you can see the temperature in the orange line, and you can see here, I've got E1, which is my Egyptian example, E2, which is my second Egyptian example, Y1, 2, and 3. This is Yazdi buildings. And so E1 relates to an Egyptian structure, but we have to know that vernacular buildings are very slow buildings to evolve over decades and millennia, because at that time, of course, communications were very slow, but they were extraordinarily widespread. So there was a solid trade routes from the east to the west, from China to Europe, and so on. You know, the simple idea of using the wind when you're hot to cool down is a very simple idea that's been used ever since the beginning of any structures, I should think. And at least since the beginning of recorded time, we have images in Egypt dating back to 13,000 BCE from the pharaonic house of Neb-Amun, from a diagram we have from a relief in the British Museum. So that's 13,000 BCE. And if you look at 1300 CE or after Christ, you can see that probably the more simple structures of the pharaohs have now evolved into highly ornate wind systems, medieval wind systems in which you have complex airstreams and flows that would have operated at different times of year and day to create comfort within those structures. Now, slow buildings, again, like communications, dispersed enormously. So the wind catchers gradually went from Cairo here and Egypt probably, and from 2,000 or 3,000 BC, gradually spread through the Middle East. But of course, the climates in those areas are very different. So when you have the wind towers of Mashhad or Heriot, they're small cowls over the living room for ventilation. If you go to Hyderabad, Sindh, you see large rooftop wind towers to direct the hot, humid air to create cooling. And again, in Bandar Abbas on the Gulf, you have towers which accept the afternoon cool breezes off the ocean. And here in Bastaqiya in Dubai and Bahrain, we have towers that probably evolved from the traveling Yazdi ostards. So you see, we've got highly dispersed wind catcher types over 4,000 or 5,000 years. But Yazd is what we're really interested in. And if we look at the local technological evolution of wind catchers over time, say we look at the last 500 years from Yazd, they technically evolved over time. So this is a Timurid 1400 AD or BCE wind catcher, a simple structure, like many of them of that period, that gradually became more and more sophisticated. The cross structured wind catchers, which here's one being repaired in 1974 in the Bagh Dolatabad in Yazd. And here we have the greatest of all Badgirs, the Qajar Badgir at the Bagh Dolatabad, 32 meters high, highly sophisticated structure in a highly sophisticated building. But over those 5,000 years, it wasn't just technological development. We had this extraordinary phenomena of the technology weaving itself into the ecology of the regions. So we had ecological evolution of the buildings and technologies. So variants of regional types in the Yazd area over centuries developed in the individual villages and towns to suit local winds and landforms and vegetations, because although on a map it looks fairly uniform, the winds in Anarak or Ardakan or Yazd would have very different wind patterns because they're associated with different land masses around them. So if we go back, in some villages, they would face all in one direction, which is the sweet winds from Khorasan. In another one, they will face in another direction, although they're still harvesting the same sweet winds. Ecological architecture, weaving buildings to the winds and the climate. And here, some of you will know what you're looking at. You're looking at the wonderful qanats of Yazd. Look at these pearl necklaces here, these little dots, and a former village there, these small dots here. Each one of those is a well going down to an underground tunnel that will be feeding this village, feeding that farmstead, feeding, this is Maybud, this town. And this extraordinary qanat supply system, where the mountains had the aquifers. So what they did was they sink a mother well into the aquifer, and then every 30 meters or so, they build another well, and they are able, through this extraordinary skills of the mulqanas, the well digger, to carry up to 65 kilometers long some of these tunnels underground. This is Payar, but which is the steps down to the water. And then we can see how that necklace of wells leads into the city and feeds the Abambar and the other buildings, the houses of the area. So I mean, this was so extraordinary. Here we have two mulqanis who are sort of digging the wells of the qanats. And these qanats then feed the abambar, the water storage system, the yakhchal, where they made ice in the deserts. They fed the buildings and that were serviced by the bargirs. And they also then related to the systems, the networks of the people. So here we have, by the way, can you all see just the screen? You can't see these pictures of us on the right. Okay. Oh, that's right. Okay. So I will take you back here. Now here is Haranag. This is a desert village, which is extraordinary technologies, remote desert village. And from miles away, 20 miles away, the Qanat feeds the Abambar with its wind towers to cool the water. It provides drinking water. It fills the tanks of the wonderful, exquisite local hammam for communal bathing. It provides a place for washing. And then that water, once used, will go down and feed the mill where they grind the corn. And then it waters the animals and spreads on the field. This is a zero waste system. Where the quality of the water at every point along that system matches the needs for it. But extraordinary in that cycle of water flow through the systems is that periodically the water quality is upcycled. So these are the yakhchal, and the water from the qanat will be fed into ponds behind these walls that are shade, the ice ponds that never get sun all year. And over the year, they can fit that underneath this ice house, there'll be a big pit up to say 14 meters here in Serjon, I think, or Maybuj, you can see it's 13 meters, I think. And they will make enough ice to fill that pit with ice. And then they cover it with straw, leave it till summer when you can have iced drinks, ice creams, iced food in this extraordinary thing. So what they're doing is they're taking the water, ordinary water, they're upcycling it into ice that you can then store, and then load shifting it into the summer beyond, so keeping it 6 months there. Look at the Abambar with all their wonderful badgir around them. And of course, these badgir are feeding, directing the wind over the water to cool it continually by evaporation. So the paeob that we saw, the stairs down to the water, can go down 20 meters, and you're taking the water at the bottom of the big water tanks, underground water tanks that have got cool, fresh water. Who needs, as they say, who needs a refrigerator where you've got an abambar? But woven into those physical systems, we have systems that co-evolve with people. So a person over the day or year will have their thermal lifestyle woven into the thermal landscapes of the buildings and the resource flows through those systems. Now, here are 3 ordinary Yazdi housewives. They wake up on the roofs of their houses. Here's the air temperature. And then they'll go downstairs and they'll busily make breakfast, and they'll pot around cooking the lunch. And then I think this is Khanum Mashrite. She will take the lunch down into the basement, nearly 10 degrees centigrade cooler, and the family will have lunch in the basement, and then they'll have their rest. And when the sun has set from the hot courtyard, they will come back up into the courtyard, pot around a bit, throw some water onto the courtyard floor, sit down in the cool evening breeze, radiating to the night sky now, until they get onto the late in the evening, about 12 o'clock, because they've had a good afternoon rest. And then they'll go to sleep on the roof where the temperature sinks until the sun rises. And so the thermal lives of people in Yazd are woven into the thermal landscapes. Now that is slowly evolving. That's taken thousands of years to evolve, that lifestyle and those buildings. And then we come on to the second type of vernacular. We have fast architecture. Suddenly money pours into a place. And this happened in Cairo in the 11th to the 14th century. It became a vastly rich city and wind catchers went up everywhere. And how do we know that? Because we have a school of erotic poetry from from Cairo, from the 11th to the 14th century, where they write eulogistic poems about my wind catcher's bigger than yours, or his isn't very big and doesn't work very well. Anyway, they get that. It's quite interesting, but it is a record of how prestigious a wind catcher was. In Yazd, something extraordinary happened. We had the low Timurid Badgirs of the 14th century, and Yazd then in the late 1700s, early 1800s became a silk weaving center on the Silk Route, and they had 164 factories in about 1860. By 1880, there were 3 left. Why? Because Yazd became the biggest opium producer in the world. And of course, the Foreign Office report here, 1853, opium is of a quality much esteemed in Yazd, and it's limited by demand. Fortunately for the Yazdis, the British made the demand go through the roof. And the finest, the cheapest, and the best opium to supply the opium wars, where the British force opium down the throats of the Chinese in order to subjugate them, the finest opium came from Yazd. And Yazd became, between 1840 and 1885, say, one of the richest cities in the world. This was like a gold mine. Fortunes were made speculating and trading in that white juice of the opium poppy. And Yazd expanded into what is probably some of the finest houses in the world. Now, here is Khane Lari, and you can find out more about it at the Khane Lari Foundation. This is one house. You see that yellow line here? It has 1 courtyard family, 2 courtyard families, 3 courtyards, 4 courtyards, 5 courtyards. And I've measured houses with 6, 7, 8 courtyards. That's how wealthy they were. And in these low mud streets, you couldn't show off your wealth very well unless you stuck a great big fancy wind catcher on the roof, which is what people did. Look at them, these beautiful towers. But these weren't just elegant ornaments that spread right throughout the old city of their different types. You know, even the 6-sided ones became quite popular, which were the sort of the acme, the flowering of the great towers. The high wind catchers of Yazd soared above these buildings, but they weren't just decorative features. The genius of the Yazdi Ostad in shaping these systems, because they're airflow systems like the erotic poems of Cairo, you know, they were always saying his is enormous, but it doesn't sort of work very well. You could have a huge Badgir, which was really not much benefit because it couldn't work very well. Now, this is Kieran McCabe, one of my colleagues in Heriot Watt, and he did a very advanced study showing that for each of these towers, because this is a shared system of airflow through these courtyards, if you increase the cross-sectional area or the height, am I getting near 20 minutes, John?
Yes, forgive me. We have hit the 20 mark. Please.
I'll try and hurry up then. I've got 5 more minutes. But the size and the height of it dictated the temperature at which the wind tower system became downdraft with the blowing wind or updraft with the buoyant air in still systems. Highly sophisticated aerodynamic systems. And look at the embellishments. Every detail splits the wind and drops it down the vents. And these extraordinary double floors, these types of details meant that you could be perfectly comfortable in 45 degrees centigrade. And every ostad, of course, needs to leave a signature. So they had a Turk's head or a flower vase or a hubble bubble, or they all left their marks on their wonderful towers. And every detail, the height of to which the partitions came down above a vent into the basement, the air flows around it, the systems of taking cool air. When these are updraft towers, when it's very hot, they'll draw the cool air from the courtyard into the basements. So you've got ventilation downdraft systems, you've got evaporative cooling within it, you've got earth coupling in it, and then you put in a little qanat. So you've got the mountain temperature. So that water in that qanat's the same temperature within half a degree that it left the mountain. And you just add that as an exquisite thing. And here's the Bari Khan on the Taft Road, owned by the, then in 1974, by the owner of the Pomar des Valleys, if anybody remembers that. And he had a Badgia 50 meters away. He had qanat coming from the water, and he used a small electric fan. How can we learn from vernacular wisdom? Isaac Mayer, who's also listening now, and I wrote something on the future of the vernacular. You have to think deeply. You have to experiment. You cannot rely on simple, blunt instruments like building models. We have lost the gift of listening to the earth, to the air, to the water, to the walls around us. We've turned our backs on the ostads who knew how to listen. They created a symbiosis between man, climate, buildings, over centuries and millennia, each learning from the one before in those slow buildings. We now today cut buildings off from their ecosystems, from their societies that co-evolved with them. We have, as modern architects, many of us sold our souls to simulation packages that dampen innovation and often prevent correct thinking. We've sold our souls to the fashion magazines full of climate blind design. We have turned our backs on generations of wisdom, passed from person to person in Yazd. Those people are gone, most of them, but all is not lost because they left us their wind catchers to learn from. And there is still time to do that. So what they also left us is Yazd, which is a monument to the genius of the Ostads who built it, building on those millennia of ecosystem level evolution. They've left the Yazdis today an unparalleled tourist venue, but they have left us far, far more if only we can learn to listen. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that wonderful presentation with beautiful, beautiful illustrations. It was clearly a beautiful, beautiful place. In just a moment, I will turn the floor over to Hossein Amanat, but I'm hoping that we will shortly have a poll available for you. And there it is. So Professor Roaf was keenly interested to know who or what proportion of our audience has actually been to Yazd. I'm going to answer this for myself. In my case, the answer, unfortunately, is no. But please do register in the poll. And
I can't actually press that poll button. Can you?
that's because actually the panelists cannot vote.
Okay.
Poll. Only the audience can. So you and I, Susan, we would cancel each other out because
Yeah.
you've been there and
Good
I.
point.
So Hossein, Amanat, and there's the results very quickly. So 37% of our audience has been to the city of Yazd, and 63% of our audience has not. Well, I hope that those of us who have never been there will one day get the chance. So now I turn the floor over to Hossein Amanat.
So I want the slides, yes. Shahyad, where are the slides?
While he's preparing his slides for us, let me remind you that if you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can pose a question, and at the end, I will voice those questions to our two panelists, or at least those that I can get to.
Thank you. Before starting, I want to thank Professor Mustafi and John, Professor McNeill, and Professor Roaf. And then I will say the most important thing that I benefited a lot from what I heard from Susan about Yazd, and it really brought a lot of memories to me because when I was in school in Iran, a school of architecture, the question of these ustads that, or what we call the memar in Iran, was completely forgotten. Architecture was what was in European magazines. Even American ones were not that important, or they're not that frequent, I should say. And we had mostly our professors from Beaux-Arts of France, and that was all, except some of them that Professor Seyhoun, who was very much in love with vernacular architecture of Iran. And we used to go every weekend, I should say, for sketching out to areas near Tehran. And when it was in holidays, we went with buses of about 60 students to places like Yazd and major parts of Iran. And we sketched from those buildings. I should say that there was a respect for the old part of old buildings because of their fascination anyway, but it was something separate. Our architecture was something that we should learn from Europeans. And it was only towards the end of my studies in 1960s that some artists and architects, and including Professor Seyhoun, who didn't do he was mostly designing monuments for the poets of Iran. And in those monuments, like from Khayyam, or the one he did for Bu Ali Sina, which is the great scientist of Iran. He referred to the old buildings. He had a reference. He looked at what they were and brought some aspects of them in his design. But in the buildings that were, let's say, a school or something, it was very little. It was people who wanted to copy things, but only the shape, not the essence of the building. What, you know, the essence of what we heard from Susan, from Dr. Roaf today was how a badgir would work. What is the function of the qanat? And all these things, and abambars. These things, I should say, were copied afterwards by architects, but it is mostly their aesthetic look. It is not their function. Now, this building, I should say, Shahyad, is the point of the turn to look at the past. It is, I think for myself, it was for a moment, I thought, you know, I'm doing something for the history of Iran, so I should look at the buildings existed before me to see how they have done it. And this is done completely in a new way, but it refers in terms of aesthetics and forms and whatever it represents, it goes to the history of Iran and the old buildings of Iran, from Ctesiphon, which is the palace of Hosseinid, to other elements that is, I don't want to talk about this monument today. I just wanted to say that after that, yes, now I'm going, excuse me, I just want, I have a short time. So I talk about some aspects that I think has been the source of inspiration to control the climate, or what Dr. Roaf was referring to today. What are those elements? And I searched for those in what I've done after I did the monument. I had a few projects in Iran. Unfortunately, my time of practice in Iran goes to when I left in 1978, November 78, and I haven't been in Iran. So my connection to Iran and designing for Iran, for that climate, for that soil, for that area has stopped. I now work in all over the world, but not in my own country. So the courtyards, which is what I'm concentrating on, this is an aerial view of Yazd, which is, you see how the courtyards all spread. It is made out of courtyards. And you see how the new modern technology, or our new life, modern life, has cut into this texture without any attention to what was there. It has, there's an amazing, and this is a good symbol of what new ways of life did to the old ways of what Susan called slow architecture. The fast architecture just cut into it. One of those courtyards, this is in Kolahdu's house. This is I have visited this house, and that's why I remembered it. The courtyard creates a kind of mini climate, microclimate, that you can live in different parts of this courtyard. First of all, there is a circulation of air, especially with the water in the middle and the trees and everything, as what Dr. Roaf said. But apart from that, you use different parts of the courtyard for different times of living. You go under this large covered area, which I can only call it an Avan, as the Persians do, and I cannot find a kind of other direct translation for it. It is an Avan. This is a room that one wall is missing, and it is outside living. It is a room outside, a room as an extension of the courtyard, of the Hayat, I should say. And I want to show you some of the beautiful courtyards from above. This is Masjid Shahyad. I don't think for the concept I should concentrate on Yazd. For me, everywhere it gives me a lesson, and I learn from everywhere. You see the courtyards here in this, but the courtyards is the source of inspiration for me to design the School of Management in Tehran. As instead of putting it in huge blocks that have no kind of, I should say, character or other things, this program has been, the entrance is a type of courtyard itself with a fountain in the middle, with a portal coming in, if you see my mouth, and then you come into this courtyard, which is a central one, but there are other little courtyards for hayats, I should go, for postgraduate studies and everything. Again, this mechanism of microclimate, I think exists here. The landscaping, most of these buildings were completed when I was not in Iran. They were done according to drawings. And I was not there to tell the Bagheban or the landscape architect not to put so much conifers, because it's easy for them. It doesn't need much water and everything. But there is no one chinar here, the traditional Persian trees has not been used in this landscape, but it's okay. Other important thing that I attract your attention to are these deep avans here, which I want to complete, sorry. This, the avan at this side, the avan at this side, going to different departments and somehow talking to the user which direction he should go. It's like a mouth that wants to eat you into the building. This is very important, I think, and I hope I'll have time to show you what can be done with the avans or what I've been inspired from. This is another layout of a center I did for the handicrafts in Tehran. The entry is into a courtyard, and then through a hashti or a covered area, you go into a bazaar-like corridor, which is where they sell the handicrafts. And then you come to a big kind of charsu, which is where two bazaars intersect. And then you go to another raste, which is a part of the bazaar for different handicrafts of zari bafi and qali bafi and ceramics and silver work and everything in it. This complex is working like a little bazaar and coming from one courtyard to another courtyard, going out to another one, and not much time. This is a look of one of the courtyards. And you see, I have controlled, instead of putting huge spans of glass under the harsh sun of Tehran, it is quite limited what you can do, because as much as you need, you have light and you have connection with outside, but not more. And again, we have a kind of opening gate to the complex, to the Hashti, and to another Hayat. Another Hayat. This seems like the kuches of Iran, the little alleys, to give a scale and everything. And then I have talked about Avon, which is the huge portals that I should say in mosques they are, but in the palace of the kings, Sassanid kings, this is an Avon, which was a room, is a large room that doesn't have one of the walls. It has the two side walls and acts as a gallery, as a huge room, a talar, or when you go to a mosque, that Avon is there, which is, this is the most beautiful renderings of ustads, as Dr. Roaf mentioned. It amazes me what they have done. This slow architecture that you mentioned, it is really fascinating. I, as an architect, I think, how did they draft the plan of this articulation in the Avon before they started? We have computers, we have everything. I tell you, doing something like that with tens of computers we have, it's not very easy. I'm doing one of similar ones now as a shrine, and I know how difficult it is to define the coordinates of these articulations. This is another view through the opening into an Avon in Masjid Shah Isfahan, Masjid Jameh, I think, not Jameh, right. And then in the embassy of Iran in Beijing, China, I have introduced this kind of entrance portal, Avon, as an entrance feature of the thing. And this is another view of the side of the embassy, just for you to know. I'm not talking about the embassy, we don't have time. This is the Baha'i World Administrative Center in Haifa, Israel. I have done all these three buildings that you see, and they are in marble and in classic Greek architecture, I should say. But one of them, which has its back towards the mountain because of the topography of the mountain, it has small courtyards for light and air and circulation. Very similar idea to Iranian buildings. And here there is an entrance portal that every building usually has in Iran a kind of, and the Avan, which here is a circular Avan and has a ventilation element in it, which I don't want to go to details about this, but this is a view of it. And so you see the concept of having an Avan is here, but it is done by Ionic Greek columns, not with the brick. But here, the Avan in the Ali Qapu Palace in Isfahan, again, a very beautiful building and beautiful idea for the royals to stand there and watch what is happening in Meydan Shah. In front of it, one of the most beautiful urban creations of that time. I don't think, Susan, you said there is nothing similar to it anywhere but Yazd, the Badir, and their features. Here, I think Meydan Shah is another creation that has no tally in the world. I hope I'm not too prejudiced as an Iranian, but anyway. But you see this place that you look into this is at the top of this tower, this time looking towards Pacific Ocean. This is in San Diego. And now about the water features. Water is very precious, as Susan mentioned. Really, it is the source of creation of any urban texture in Iran. It is anything, a village or a life, a source of the life in that hot desert is only the water of these qanats that come. So it is so precious. You can't leave it like the French or free kind of channels. We have to control it, but we have to enjoy looking at it and enjoy its freshness and coolness.
Hossein, I just want to remind you we're at approximately 20 minutes. Keep going. We're not really rushed for time. But
Thank you. Yes, that is the Avan again, with the water in front of it in Cheher Sutun. Again, it's Safavid creation. This is the fountains in front of Shahyad, which is very much inspired from those. You see, to be inspired from the aesthetics of it are very easy. To do the function as a bagir, to cool a space with our new life and the way expectations after they have all the air conditions in their hands is not as easy, I should say. This is again School of Management with its entry portals, everything, and the Embassy of Iran at night. And another bazaar. This is another creation of those ustads, dear Susan. You see, I, as an architect, I cannot imagine how they did start thinking about and drawing the plan and creating this. It is something that I hope it is not totally lost in Iran, but it is. I see nowadays they repair the old houses, and there are some ustads in Yazd and Kashan, and anyway, this is inside the Shahyad monument. There is a concrete dome with the white concrete, and it is inspired from those. But I have had all this technology and everything. I haven't reached anything like what you saw by those ustads. But this is the kind of charsu of in the handicraft center, again with bricks, and the hashti of the entrance in handicraft center again. You see how the light is reflecting into this little pool. And in Haifa, the building here, Shamseh, which is a sunburst, has been used in the top of the atrium, another view of it, and in the Temple of Samoa, in Western Samoa in Pacific, near the equator, which is very hot and humid. This temple is working something very preliminary, but it works. And that is that there are some louvers here, glass louvers as common locally here, and it lets the air in. And there are some fans at the very top of this dome that takes the air out. But creating that, it gives a very good climate inside the temple. And this is the view of the temple from inside. Again, with white concrete, no finishes, nothing, and you can see the light comes in a very Persian pattern. I think the rest of it is, I'm finished, and I thank you and wait for the questions that would come.
Okay, Hossein, thank you very much. If you could stop sharing your screen, we could, there you go, well done. So now, first I want to thank both of our panelists for those glorious presentations, explaining some of the harmony between place and building, both ancient and modern. So now I'm going to ask our panelists a few of the questions that appear in the Q&A. There are several comments in the Q&A, which I will not read, except to say that Professor Roaf earns a compliment on her pronunciation of Persian terms and place names. Here's a question from Layli. Layli asks, were wind catchers also status symbols? Did poor people not have access to the technology?
We have we have the slow buildings. So the ordinary local villager would have had a wind catcher on their own summer house. And obviously, if you're a very wealthy merchant about 1850 in Yazd, and you build an enormous double-story wind catcher, which is, we can get this from the 11th century poets, you know, his is much higher than mine, rising into the sky and dwarfing everybody else's. So yes, it definitely was a status symbol, but also it was a tool of manipulation, because around about 1895, Zoroastrians in the city, because Yazd is a great refuge city in the desert, a lot of Baha'is, a lot of Zoroastrians, and there was a rule in the city that a Zoroastrian couldn't have a wall that was higher than you could reach up, and they couldn't have wind catchers. I think that changed later on as they became more wealthy and powerful. But so it was seen to be a way of keeping different parts of the section, different sections of the population down, as well as elevating other people who were very wealthy. But no, every villager could have had a simple one that they would have got all their friends and family in to help them build on the back of their Iran. on in their village house.
So here's a question from John Fisk. John asks, does anyone build wind catchers today?
Yes, lots and lots of people are building wind catchers today. They're very popular. They're such beautiful structures, but also they are the modern engineers and architects like to play with what's complex. Say you get some fabulous people like Ford and Short in Britain who've done wind towers on Maltese breweries or on libraries. And then, of course, we had the great Jeff Cook in Arizona who promoted the design of wind catchers and testing. Because you see, one thing is that I think with this extra reliance on always computer modeling, you sometimes cannot design. You see, Amanat. In Yazd, I actually have picture books of how you create those arches. You put a piece of string in at one point, a peg in at one point, and a piece of string, and you can create really complex systems of arches and vaults with a piece of string and a peg in the ground. And that's how they did it. You know, so you can't design them maybe with the computer models, or you can, but a lot of advanced engineering firms now are trying to create really effective wind catchers. But what I wish people would do would be go out and just be with the wind catchers, measure the wind going up and down them, measure the temperatures in and around them, get a feel for them. Because one of my fields of expertise is thermal comfort. And the first thing you need to be a good thermal designer is a thermal sense. So you know what's getting warmer or cooler. It's like a switch in the brain that you can switch on and off. And once you've got a thermal sense, you go into a room and you think, oh, that's a very cold corner, or that's a warm corner. And then you'll start asking questions. Why is it cold? Why is it warm? And so on. Yes, there are a lot of them. There's a lot of excitement, but I would urge people to do bench test models in laboratories or in their studios. Just build them out of paper or cornflake boxes or something and play with them. And then do field tests, you know, build actual models and see how they work in reality. Because I think modeling is limited, but, you know, you need that thermal sense to be a great designer.
So here's a question from M. Rod. Dr. Amanat, how long did it take for Shahyad to be completed, start to finish?
The contract was 30 months and it was done in 30 months because the ceremony to open it was already planned. So yes, I think that's it was not easy, but they built it. But you know, I think, Susan, this is very important. Nowadays, architects are very limited. Those ustads, they had their kind of freedom in doing what they were doing. And any step they took was not that expensive. Here, whatever we do has a budget, and we have to stick to that budget. And there is a city planning codes that limits you in everything. You can't go up with your badgir. If you go with your badgir up, you have to lower the ceiling of your room. It is ridiculous. You don't have that freedom that you had in those times.
Okay, I've been thinking about this. I'm thinking about beauty because the Iranian designers, many of them I know, just in their lifestyle and their elegance, and they know what beauty is. And I think that that might come from being the next generation in a long series of generations who've worked and lived with that beauty. It's like Italian designers. I mean, they grew up with those great Italian buildings before them. It's like the Scandinavians' proportions. Now, they had the wonderful sort of Viking architecture and history that they built from. So I think this passing on from generation to generation is hugely important. What I'm worried about is that modern architecture, like you say, the Bauhaus cut everything. Yeah. And everything was thrown out. But you can't throw out all that amazing wisdom. So I think we have to go back to architect, the vernacular of a place, and try and get that wisdom that we can learn from those buildings and then reapply it in modern ways. Beauty doesn't cost money.
So here's a question from Dave that speaks to the vernacular of a particular place. Dave asks, is it possible to use the vernacular of Yazd in modern Iranian architecture, considering modern thermal expectations and climate change?
Susan, you please go forward. No.
No.
For me, architecture is interwoven, is a part, they are the same as urban design. And urban design has a lot to do these days with the political will. What you want to do in your city, what the planner wants to do, and then comes down to the architect. So in Iran, what we have to do, and I've said it before, and in all over the world, if we want, we have to have good planners that understand the body of persons and the psyche of persons, and would think about what a human being wants to be in, and not to think of cars to rule persons, people. At the moment, in most of our societies, cars are the ruling elements. They should be taken out as much as possible. And we need a good planner to enforce it in different environments of the city. Then architect becomes inspired with the texture of the city as it was in Yazd and in all the desert cities of Iran, Kashan and everywhere. That creates itself a mood that the architect can take advantage and do the beauties that Susan is mentioning.
I'd like to say that the modern architect and the modern planner and everybody, they've been sold a turkey, right? And this turkey is the idea that a building is a box in which there's a climate and it's ruled by the air conditioner, and all year you have to have the same climate indoors. And this is so patently wrong. A building is a complex thermal landscape where you get hot bits and cold bits, where you can throw open the window at night in the summer or during the day. We have been deprived of sensuality, and there is nothing more sensual than sitting on an Iran in the evening after a hot day on a carpet, on probably the warm marble of the Ivan, but on a carpet with the cool evening breeze over the skin with a cool drink or a cup of tea or some melon and just looking at the stars. I mean, that sensuality with being connected with nature. You can do an awful lot with reimagining how architects can sensually connect people back to the nature around buildings, back to the ecosystems. And okay, so when it's very hot or very cold, you shut the windows and you put the fire on. or you shut the windows and put the fan on and then the air conditioner. But that's only for a fraction of the year. What you can learn, if you can learn that the sensual ways in which pleasure is donated or given to the body through great architecture, and a warm evening, or a, you know, or a winter's day when you're sitting in the sun or so on, you can create all those pools of interaction just as they did in the Yazdi houses. But for goodness sake, don't think that it's the only thing you can exist for is an air-conditioned building with the windows closed all year.
I must say, Susan, that sounds a good deal more agreeable than being confined to my basement with Zoom. Here's a practical question. It comes from Abbas Amanat, who shares a name with a most prominent specialist in the history of Qajar, Iran. Abbas Amanat asks, how cost efficient is vernacular architecture if one intends to revive, for instance, the wind towers?
If I might,
it is cost efficient, but the expectation of us after we have used air conditioners, I think, makes it difficult. We have to have a kind of consensus to be accepting this kind of new ideas that come. I want to say we've done buildings with office buildings with nowadays large offices, and the air condition is constantly working, and one lady is complaining about her position, which is cold, and the other person says, I'm very hot. And they are not ready to accept a little bit of a difference of temperature because they're spoiled with air conditioning and conditioned. I think it is possible, it is cost efficient to do those techniques now, but people's psychology should help. If otherwise they won't accept those houses, they go to air condition again. Susan, I don't know, what do you think, Sue?
Well, I think the whole of the way in which people have been shoved like sardines into office spaces, the open plan office, more and more people, partitions, you know, trying to squeeze as much value out of it. And look what's happened. We have the COVID crisis. These buildings are not occupiable. If they had, you know, really pleasant, well-sized windows that could open, you could at least purge the virus out and actually make it a much healthier space to live in. I think people after COVID are going to relearn a lot. We have another problem too, is that well, you can run any building for as you know, as much of the year or day as possible simply by opening windows, but people have been persuaded by the regulations that they shouldn't open windows because that interferes with the efficiency of the air conditioners. And what we learned in the tobacco smoking era, that the passive ventilation lobby, when they allowed people to smoke indoors, and all the regulators said, that's fine. All we have to do is increase the speed of the air through the space. And there are a lot of studies there where they found out that the people who are making you shut the windows suffer from an affiliation bias because, for instance, they're making the money to put the air conditioners in. We need to completely rethink architecture now. And not least because we can't afford the huge amounts of energy needed to create these artificial environments anymore.
Here's a more specific question from Matthias Rudolph. Matthias wonders about the size of courtyards versus shading. In vernacular architecture, were there shading systems that shaded the courtyard, such as retractable textile shading sails?
First of all, shading is very important, at least in Iran, I should say. Whatever building you build, you face it towards south and you have a shade above. So because you want to take advantage of the movement of sun. So yes, that is important. But again, it has been forgotten. In Iran, it is done, but I work in Vancouver and the direction of south, north, or east is not at all important. Nobody addresses it. So I should say it is very important, the control of sun. It helps a lot, but it depends how much the architects take advantage of it. Sorry, what I said, because the view of the beautiful ocean in Vancouver takes over from which direction you are. You want to see the ocean, so you ignore which direction you receive the light of the sun. Sorry, thank you.
Isn't it extraordinary, Amanat, that in somewhere so beautiful and cool as Vancouver, that you can't just naturally cool and ventilate buildings? It's madness. This is what I say. We're a generation where we have been sold a turkey that you have to have big machines to make buildings occupiable.
Right, and you know that there are new directives like LEED, I'm sure you are aware of it, that we do buildings according to these directives to be limited in use of air conditioning and control the consumptions of energy. Yes.
This is the world we live in, because LEED was developed by someone called Rick Fredresky, I think, who was, while he was developing LEED, was the lead research director for carrier air conditioning. And LEED was developed so you couldn't actually get a LEED rating, a platinum rating, without having full central air conditioning. So this is the types of affiliation bias that's woven into all our regulations, our rating schemes. It's almost, I mean, I think it's really, I think it's morally bankrupt. You know, we don't have regulations now that promote natural ventilation. We don't have them that actually genuinely promote the use of thermal mass to store the heat from the sun in the day to use at night. We have them that simply are suited to creating a cardboard box building with a machine in. So, I mean, this has to change, because we are destroying the climate. You know, these buildings are crimes against nature. A lot of these big glass buildings, another one's just opening in London. These are unnecessary, unwanted, that's unneeded floor space. Surely, the people like the Googles, the Microsofts, the people with money and sense are going to lead the investment in a new generation of buildings that work with nature and not try and kill it.
So we've got a couple minutes left. I'd like to get at least one more question out, and I apologize to everyone whose question is not being voiced. Over 70 questions have been asked, which is a wonderful testament to the provocative nature of the presenter's work today. Here's a question from Nadere Shamlu. Forgive me if I mispronounced the name. I heard that some of the Emirates have registered Badgirs as their cultural heritage with UNESCO. Is this true? Certainly many of the buildings in Dubai, Qatar, etc., which claim to have inspiration from local architecture are modeled after Iranian Yazdi architecture. Has Iran lost the claim to this technology with the UNESCO registration? Does such a registration matter at all?
The Bodgirs, for instance, Bastakia on the Dubai Creek, were built by the Ostads who came in from Iran. So whether you call them Iranian or just local, they have different head details. They're much simpler. But then you get the very sophisticated Badgirs of Bahrain, which are really wonderful. And they again will have been influenced by the great Ostads of Yazd, I think.
Okay, let me squeeze
So
one last.
I think many people can register many things, but the truth is this. I don't think they can change the truth.
Okay, I think the time has come for me to turn the floor over to Shiva for her concluding remarks. So let me say on my behalf, thank you to both Hossein Amanat and to Dr. Susan Roaf for giving us their time this afternoon, this evening, or this morning, depending on where you might be. Shiva.
Thank you so much, Dr. McNeill. I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone who joined us today and for your participation and continued support in our events. Today's event was recorded and will be available on the Persian Studies website. There were a lot of questions, as Dr. McNeill stated. We will ask our panelists if it's possible for them to answer the remaining questions electronically so that they may be sent out via email. We will have more events in March for Nowruz, and on April 23rd, we will have the Conference of the Birds, so please be on the lookout for those invitations. We thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.